Hi everyone, it's Laura here. I'm just doing this short video to explain a little bit around something called the pensions input amount. Now, the pensions input amount is something that you might see if you've received something called a pension saving statement. And what that statement is doing is saying that you might have exceeded your tax-free pensions limit for the year. So if you receive one of these statements, then you will always need to look at it and take action. Now, what we're talking about here is something called the annual allowance. And the annual allowance is the limit on the amount of tax-free pensions growth someone can have in a tax year. So if you are within that allowance, there's fine, there's no action to take. If you go outside of that allowance, then there may be action to take. Most people will go through all of their career having no idea what this allowance is, and that's because they've never exceeded it. But some of you will, and you will be notified by the pension scheme through this statement called the pension savings statement. So it's really important that when you receive one of these statements, you must look at it to understand if there's any action for you to take. Now, the statements do look different across all of the public sector pension schemes, which is why I'm not showing you one of them today. But if you have one, you do need to look at it. They're typically sent out through the post and usually each October. But it might be that you're also watching this video because you've received a remedial pension savings statement. We've reviewed that for you and it now shows that you have some pensions tax to pay, which perhaps might be a bit of a surprise because it's not something you've done before. So all I'm going to try and do here is just to explain to you a little bit about what this is and how it works. Now, what we're looking at is something called the pensions input amount. And the pensions input amount is the way in which we measure the growth in your pension for schemes such as the public sector pension schemes. And what we do is we calculate the pensions input amount and then we compare that to the annual allowance, which is that limit on your tax-free pension growth. And if you are over your allowance, then you therefore may have some pensions tax to pay. With schemes such as the public service pension schemes, what we're looking at is the growth in your annual pension amount. So it's not about the contributions that you and your employer have paid, it's about the increase in your annual pension. And the reason for that is because these schemes provide you with an annual income for life when you stop work, very much like a salary. So what we're measuring is how much that annual income has increased by in a tax year. So we would look at the annual pension at the start of a tax year. Let's say that was £10,000. And we would compare that to your annual pension at the end of the tax year, which let's say that was £12,000. That means the increase in that annual pension is £2,000. And that's essentially what we're looking at when we look at the pensions input amount. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. I'm trying to keep it really simple just to build the foundations of your understanding. What we actually do is we take the annual pension you've built up at the start of a tax year and make an adjustment for inflation. And we would deduct that from the annual pension at the end of the tax year. And that gives us then the real-time growth in your annual pension when compared with inflation. So let's say for this example that is £2,000, the difference between these two figures, the start and the end. We then have to multiply that by a HMRC factor of 16. That factor of 16 is the same for everybody and has been in place since 2010. And it's really just a reflection to say that when you receive your annual pension at retirement, you don't receive it once. You receive it every year that you're alive. And so it's taking account of those multiple times of payment. The thing, of course, is when we multiply anything by 16, it does make it quite a lot bigger. So if we take our £2,000 and multiply that by 16, that gives us 32,000, and that is our pension input amount. So for some of you who've now got tax charges, what we're saying is when we do this calculation, it's giving you an amount that's over that allowance, and that could result in a tax charge. Pension input amounts can fluctuate quite a lot. So when you look at your statement, you might see some years it says 0, some years it's quite a high amount, some years it's quite a low amount. Where it says 0, it doesn't mean the pension is worth 0. It doesn't mean anything's been taken away from your pension. What it means is that the growth in your pension in that year was not as high as inflation. So it might be that perhaps you haven't had a pay rise, or you haven't had a very big pay rise compared to inflation. Where it's a very high amount, that would usually indicate a jump up in pay. So perhaps you've had an increment, for example, something like that. You've got extra CEA points when they were pensionable. Anything like that will push up your pension and will then push up all of your final salary benefits, which gives you a bigger growth in that year, which is good news. It means the pension has jumped up. Consequence of that can be that you might have a tax charge to manage. Similarly, if the pension's input amount is more than zero but not very big, it might mean that there was a bit of an increase, but it wasn't particularly substantial. So fluctuating pension input amounts where you've got final salary sections, such as classic or premium in civil service, 95 or 08 in NHS, etc. That's quite typical depending on what has happened to pay and overall growth. The career average sections, the 2015 sections, should see a fairly steady amount, either going up or being similar to the year before, because it's calculated based on pay each year. So that's just to give you an explanation as to why these things occur, and it's usually a trigger is usually because of a big change in pay. Okay, so hopefully that will help just give you a bit of support. For those of you who we've contacted because we've done your HMRC assessment, we've also sent you a fact sheet about this, and that fact sheet does explain it to you a bit more as well if you have a read of that. So hopefully that will give you a little bit of a hand. If you do need anything else, do refer to the websites. We also have an explanation webinar on our main Pengage website that talks to you about the remedial pension savings statement in full, and it runs for around about 75 minutes. So you may also want to watch that if you also need some additional support.